First of all, of course, I would like to thank the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives for this kind opportunity to have this humble lecture. And the second, of course, to excuse my terrible English. Well, I will try to start. The problem of Tibet's status and statehood remains a matter for discussion, as all of us know. The most widespread is the view that Tibet was a part of the Qing China, and after the collapse of the Qing, it was a de facto independent state until 1950s. There are also well-known hypotheses that Tibet was a stateless society, or a so-called pseudo-state, or that it was always an inseparable part of China. These ideas are rooted not only in Chinese statements, but also in concepts of some Western authors, for example, Geoffrey Samuel and Barry Zautman. On the other hand, Michael van Walt van Praag and some other scholars have shown that Tibet had significant legal characters of statehood according to modern international law. So was Tibet a stateless society, a pseudo-state, and or a part of China? I will try to analyze the problem of Tibet's statehood based on historical facts, including international relations in the past and their correspondence with modern international law. There is a consensus among researchers that at least from the 70s to the 19th century, Tibet was a large and powerful empire, competed with the Chinese Tang Empire by its influence. There is no problem with Tibetan statehood in that time, of course, if we will consider that empires are states. In between 19th and 11th centuries, Tibetan Empire lost its power and fragmented into many principalities. This process was not unique for Tibet. Such fragmentations are well known in many empires of the West and East, including China as such. Many scientists indicate that this period of fragmentation ended with the period of Mongolian conquest of Tibet, first in 1240 by the Mongol commander Dordar Khan, who operated under the command of Godan, grandson of famous Genghis Khan. It should be noted that there is some delusions regarding these first Mongolian commanders entering Tibet. Dordar Khan is not a name. If we will translate it from Mongolian, it will mean low position Darkhan. Darkhan was one of official titles in the Mongolian Empire. And Gadan was not Khan. He was a prince, but of course grandson of Genghis Khan. Gadan, having sent the invitation to Tibet, Kongang Yaltsen, the head of Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism, might have considered the fact that this school followed old traditions. It was very influential in Tibet and had many contacts with lay authorities. In addition, Mongols were attracted by Tantra, as we know from some Mongolian sources, and their society was similar to the Tibetan one, as was also known from some works of Mongolian scholars. In 1253, the nephew of Kongang Yaltsen, Pagpa Lama, converted to Buddhism Mongolian Prince Kublai, that time only prince, who established with him priest-patron relations. These were relations between Lama and his lay patron, which probably well known to everybody, and I will not discuss this. Later, Kublai granted to Pagpa Lama supreme power over the whole Tibet. In 1271, after that, Kublai conquered China and proclaimed the Yuan dynasty. Since then, higher Sakya Lama sufficiently ruled the most of Tibet, except for its northern areas, which were exempted by Mongols from their direct jurisdiction. It is often considered that Kublai, having proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, had become a Chinese emperor and since then Tibet was ruled by the Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties of China. These points need clarification. Traditionally, China has been ruled by imperial dynasties, which is known to all. The term dynasty in Europe and its Chinese analog Chao have different meanings. In Europe, dynasty is name of a line of rulers from the same family. So-called Chinese dynasty is a name of a state during the period of reign of one family that has adopted the Chinese concept of monarchic power. It is such a state which includes a part of China, or it contains China as a whole, or it is just China, or it is a part of it that was proclaimed to be a state, or it is a state adjacent to Chinese borders whose ruler, having proclaimed himself the emperor, claimed for Chinese throne. I apologize for so long phrase, but I hope that this covers all types of relationships described as so-called Chinese dynasties. While in Europe the concept and designation of dynasty are separated from the concept and designation of a state, in China both are intermingled. While in Europe the notion of dynasty is separate from the concept and the designation of the state, in China it is connected. Also, when an individual ruler is discussed, it can be separate too. For example, we know some cases when Chinese emperors, which belonged to already existed dynasties, proclaimed new dynasties. And not only Chinese. For example, it was the case of Kublai Khan. Initially it was not Yuan, but he had proclaimed earlier another dynasty, but then it changed it. But on the reign of the same ruler. As a result, in traditional Chinese worldview, China had never been incorporated into a conquest state. Instead, only dynasties may be changed in China. This is archaic Sinocentric concept, and it continues to be used in history, in policy now. According to it, China is the only state in the world which never lost its statehood and sovereignty because all its conquerors became so-called Chinese dynasties. Such or similar view never used anywhere, only in China. However, if we will analyze history beyond this Sinocentric model, we will come to quite different conclusion. The term China has been used for designation of different states in different margins. As I said in some of my lectures earlier, Byzantine Empire is a very good example. You know that different countries, including Russian kingdom, proclaimed themselves as Byzantine Empire, that they have inherited Byzantine Empire, and so on. Even just after the conquest of Constantinople, one of the titles of the Turkish Sultan was the King of Byzantium, and so on, also in the Western Europe. Thus, these Chinese or so-called barbarian states included real Han China, completely or in parts. However, beyond the frames of Chinese culture, it was impossible to establish a legitimate dynasty in China. The Han people composed a large majority in these empires. Foreign conquerors adopted Chinese state system and proclaimed the dynasties of China to legitimate themselves among this Han majority. However, they constructed their relations with non-Han peoples differently, thus violating these Chinese traditions. So let's return to Yuan. The Yuan was really not China. It was a Mongolian state, Great Mongolian Empire, which included China as only a part. The priest-patron relationships there cannot be described in the modern legal terms. The supreme authority over Tibet was given to the Sakya heads by a Mongolian monarch. But this Mongolian monarch himself established the legitimacy of his power in accordance with a religious mandate from the Tibetan Lama. The control of Tibetans by the Mongols may be explained as a help in maintaining peace in Tibet and assistance in the management, but not as inclusion of Tibet into the Yuan Empire. Borders of this empire were unclear because Western Khanats or kingdoms ruled by other descendants of Chinggis Khan were nominal vassals of the Yuan Mongol Great Khan, whose residence was Beijing. Nominally, this empire stretched from Europe to Pacific Ocean, the Yuan Empire, and rulers of all these areas recognized themselves vassals to the Mongolian Great Khan, but it was not the case of Sakya heads. Having overthrown the Yuan dynasty, China again had become an independent state, now as Ming Empire, in 14th to 17th century. At the meantime, personal priest-patron relations of Tibetan lamas existed with Chinese rulers in parallel with the Mongols. These links did not affect the governing of Tibet. Claimed evidence that Tibet was ruled by the Ming are limited to a few superficial attributes similar to those used by the Ming for other foreigners. There is a long list of so-called Ming tributaries, which includes many independent states, such, for example, as Japan, Ceylon, and so on, which nothing to do with China. They were considered so-called tributaries because, according to the above-mentioned archaic Chinese worldview, all missions to Chinese emperor might visit his country only as tributaries, and neither state was considered equal to China in the world. In 1578, Mongolian king Altan Khan granted the title of Dalai Lama to one of the supreme lamas of the Gelug sect. Altan Khan and his people adopted Buddhism and established with the Dalai Lama priest-patron relations. In 1642, another Mongol, Gushi Khan, at that time he was an independent ruler, transferred authority over the whole Tibet to the fifth Dalai Lama. Thus, the establishment of the Gelug theocracy and centralization of Tibet also belonged to Mongols and not to China. According to the data from Russian Foreign Ministry archive, the 13th Dalai Lama wrote about the situation in Tibet in the Ming time that Tibet represented 13 small, fairly independent principalities. Gushi Khan subdued them and transferred secular authority over them to the fifth Dalai Lama, and Gushi Khan himself nevertheless was not king of Tibet. It was from letters of the 13th Dalai Lama written in the beginning of the 20th century. In that period, when these events appeared, Manchus established the Qing Empire. The latter was established beyond China and existed first time as a neighboring independent state. Then the Manchu Qing state conquered the Chinese Ming Empire, Chinese Ming state. The situation was somewhat similar to that with the Yuan Empire. China again lost its statehood. Again it became a part of foreign state, now a part of Manchu state. For legitimization of their power among the Chinese or Han people, the Manchus adopted Chinese imperial system. Then, subjecting Mongolia and stretching their influence to Tibet, Manchu emperors used ways of their legitimization traditional for those people and not for Chinese. Tibetans considered their relations with the Qing according to the priest-patron principle. However, in the eyes of many Chinese officials and chroniclers, as far as in the eyes of a part of foreigners, Tibet became a part of the Qing territory. Can these statements be regarded as legal recognition of the Qing suzerainty over Tibet? In reality, there was neither a vassal oath of the Dalai Lamas to the emperors, nor a military conquest of Tibet, nor an agreement on its incorporation into the Qing Empire. This contrasted with the relations of the Qing with Chinese, Mongols, and the Turks. The influence of the Manchu emperors in Tibet reached its peak in the late 18th century when the residents, called Amban in Manchu, in Lhasa, were declared equal in power to the Dalai Lama in secular affairs. However, appointments of Tibetan officials were done there in coordination with the Tibetans. Tibetans accepted Manchu management in some affairs, but it did not mean inclusion of their country into the Qing or China. This did not change the priest-patron relations to vassalage. According to materials of the Russian Foreign Archives, the 13th Dalai Lama in early 20th century emphasized several times that there was neither conquest by force of arms nor any state act or document confirming the ruling of China over Tibet. The 13th Dalai Lama indicated a purely nominal dependence of his country. He confirmed the priest-patron relations with the emperor. According to one of his letters, the supreme authority over Tibet given to the Dalai Lama by Mongols was not abolished by the Manchus. These opinions of the Dalai Lama are not less important than opinions of the opposite side. Therefore, only the priest-patron relations were recognized by both sides, both monarchs, the Dalai Lama and the Qing emperor. Yes? Within the framework of the priest-patron relationship, the emperor had to assist the Dalai Lama in secular affairs. Appointment of the Amban, or resident, yes, some officials and garrisons in Tibet, regents at the absence of Dalai Lamas or at their young years, may be explained clearly in this way. Assistance in religious sphere included imperial intervention in clerical management for prevention of abuses, which was explained, for example, in famous inscriptions by the Qianlong emperor in the Yunhegun temple in Beijing. Yes? Attributes of this assistance from the emperor were seals and diplomas certifying the authenticity of reincarnations of high lamas, use of the golden urn to draw lots with the names of new reincarnations, which was taken by Ambans or by lamas in their presence. The Amban has less power than the Dalai Lama. The golden urn was used selectively, only to settle conflict situation, and the Amban served only as arbiter, but not as the supreme power who commanded to take this or another lot from the urn. Only few incarnations of the Dalai Lamas and the Panchen Lamas, as well of Jetsun Dambakho Tuktus, were determined using the golden urn. It should be noted however, that until 20th century the Dalai Lamas relatively rarely ruled Tibet personally. Many of his incarnations died at a young age, and regents appointed by the emperor's decrees ruled instead of them. However, these regents had only an interim power up to the full age of the Dalai Lama. This does not mean change in supreme power in Tibet. If there were neither legal basis nor effective power of the Qing over the whole Tibet, where are roots of the view that Tibet has become a part of China as a vassal to the Qing? This is above mentioned Chinese imperial tradition adopted by the Qing. This tradition does not allow equal relations of all countries with the emperors ruling in China. In this tradition, there may be only one emperor in the world, and any gifts to him were interpreted as a tribute, a sign of submission, and the person who received the imperial edict, seal, or title had become automatically an imperial official, so imperial subject. This is why there were so many tributaries to Ming Empire and also Qing. Yes, this corresponds. Such system corresponds with uncertainty of status of some lands claimed by the Qing, despite on maps, especially European maps, the borders of the empire was delimited very clearly, but names of its different parts were different, and sometimes in some maps Tibet was also indicated as a separate country. In addition, a considerable part of Tibetan lands subordinated to Beijing only nominally, really comprising these stateless societies and these lands were later claimed by both real states, Tibet and China, real capital cities, Lhasa and Beijing. And of course, then in Nanjing and Beijing as the Republican China. Overall crisis of the Qing since the mid-19th century was accompanied with transition from tributary to treaty-based system of international relations in the empire. With the fear of Western expansion, the Beijing regime of Dowager Empress Cixi took a course to transformation of Mongolia and Tibet into Chinese colonies. In that period, Great Britain tried to maintain a buffer zone with no influences of the Qing and Russian empires at the north of India, which was British colony. The British military expedition in 1904 planned to open Tibet for England. As a result, the 13th Dalai Lama fled to Mongolia. Not less important is that this British interference stimulated the Qing to strengthen their dominance in Tibet. According to data from the Russian Foreign Archive, the 13th Dalai Lama said that Beijing government violates rights of him and rights of Mongolia. He provided historical evidences on the right of his secular power in Tibet. He emphasized that both Tibet and Mongolia have never been under full sovereignty of China, and with the abolition of the Manchu dynasty, Mongolia and Tibet should be so independent as before. The Cixi regime, Dowager Empress regime, confiscated rank from the Dalai Lama, which is nonsense, of course, historically, and declared Tibet so-called feudatory to China. The Chinese passed it in Lhasa the announcement on this decree, but the Tibetans tore it away, showing that they obey the Dalai Lama and not to Beijing. On September 7, 1904, the representatives of Britain and Tibet signed the convention in Lhasa. This convention showed the recognition by the British Empire to the Tibetan government's capacity to enter into agreements independently from the Manchu emperor. But only 3 years later, the Chinese suzerainty over Tibet was first recognized in an international document, and it was recognized by a third party and not by the Qing, China or Tibet. In December 1909, the Dalai Lama returned to Lhasa. However, a Qing army marched to Tibet. The Dalai Lama fled to India, and the Dowager Empress Longyu, the new Dowager Empress, issued a decree that the Dalai Lama was again disposed of his title, and for the second time as a punishment for his flight from Lhasa, his ingratitude, and so on. The cruelties of Qing soldiers in Tibet, annexation of the territory, and attempts to dispose and appoint the Dalai Lama led to cessation of the priest-patron relations, which is quite logical, I think. This is evident also from the letters of the 13th Dalai Lama. The Xinhai Revolution in China led to the collapse of the Qing Empire and proclamation of the Republic of China, a nation-state of the Han people. The Han nationalism became the key driving force in this new state. Han nationalists claimed whole territory of the former Manchu Qing Empire. For this goal, they invented the concept of the Republic of 5 races or 5 nationalities, including Tibetans and Mongols. This concept is wrong from scientific point of view, both from the point of view of biology, anthropology, and history. Western powers nevertheless recognize Chinese Republic in the Qing borders, not due to historical truth, but only because of the economical and political expediency. For example, in a similar case with the Ottoman Empire, they displayed another behavior regarding recognition of new states. In fact, similarly to China, Mongolia and Tibet also proclaimed their independence as a part of the collapsed Qing Empire. Tibetans and Mongols did not participate in the Shanghai Revolution, elaboration of the doctrines of five razes and the Chinese nation. This was done by Han people, but not Mongols or Tibetans. Their movements were directed to establishment of their own independent states, but not the Republic of China. Correspondence of the leaders of Tibet and Mongolia, the 13th Dalai Lama and the 8th Jetsun Dampa, with Chinese President Yuan Shikai, clearly reflects this. In 1911, Mongolia declared her independence. On November 3, 1912, the Russia-Mongolia Treaty was signed. Contents of its Mongolian version is a little different from its Russian version, and the Mongolian version reveals clearly that it is a formal recognition of independence of Mongolia, but not of autonomy. Earlier researchers have not compared these versions, but they were equipotential. There were no priority of any of these two versions. On January, why I say about this? In January 11, 1913, so after the treaty between Mongolia and Russia was signed, yes? The Mongol-Tibetan Treaty was signed in the capital city of Outer Mongolia. It contains mutual recognition of both states, Mongolia and Tibet. As Mongolia was earlier recognized as an independent state by Russia, the Mongol-Tibetan Treaty meant valid international recognition of Tibet by already recognized independent Mongolia. Therefore, Tibet also became independent state, not only de facto, but also de jure. And I think this is important issue because it is a usual idea that Tibet was only de facto state, independent state. From that time to the occupation by People's Republic of China, Tibet met commonly accepted criteria of statehood contained in the Article 1 on the Montevideo Convention of Rights and Duties of State, signed in 1933. But Tibet corresponds earlier to these articles, many of which are permanent population, defined territory, not borders, but defined territory, government and capacity to enter into relations with the other states. Tibet was, of course, not a strictly centralized state. Instead, it consisted of principalities, or using Melvin Goldstein term subunits. They had different degree of autonomy. The most influential of them was the subunit of the Panchen Lama. However, the subunits were not states independent from the government in Lhasa. Weakening of central power to the periphery in Tibet has also many analogues in different states in the 19th and 20th centuries, for example, Russian, Ottoman, and Qing empires. After the death of President Yuan Shikai in 1916, China plunged into strife for a long time and could not pay much attention to Tibet. The Tibetan government was trying to win back Tibetan areas incorporated into the Chinese provinces. Tibet extended its international relations, including those with Russia, to some other Western countries and Japan. However, the states did not recognize expressly the independence of Tibet. The struggle between Tibetan aristocratic groups after the death of the 13th Dalai Lama, inexperience of Tibetan leaders in policy, territorial defense, and most importantly, the lack of effective support from the world powers coincided with the consolidation of China under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. There is important but poorly known fact in the history of the Chinese Republic. According to the data published in the Soviet Union, the victory of Mao Zedong in his struggle with Kuomintang was merit of Joseph Stalin, but not the merit of Mao. Kuomintang could win Chinese Communist Party even without American support, but Stalin's military and economic support to Mao Zedong was so great that it allowed him to consolidate China and also occupy Tibet, Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang. It is truly a result of foreign assistance. Now there are many statements in Chinese People's Republic that the Han people and under the guidance of Chinese Communist Party with assistance of minority nationalities led by Mao Zedong had great victory. But without assistance of Stalin, they will never have this victory. It is really a result of this foreign assistance. As Tibet was the de facto and de jure independent state, the invasion of People's Republic of China there was contrary to international law, violating the principles of state sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, non-intervention and prohibition of the threat of force. Well known to all of us, 17-point agreement signed in 23rd May of 1951 between Tibet and China was signed during ongoing aggression, the beginning of occupation of Tibet and under duress. This corresponds to the points in this agreement, especially those that involve its internal status and military occupation. The statement that China would take full control of all Tibet and the threat of an immediate attack to Lhasa if Chinese conditions were not accepted. In addition, the Tibetan delegation has no credentials to sign such agreement, and the Tibetan seals which were used there were fabricated in Beijing. There is a long discussion in literature regarding these seals. Some people, some scholars write that it is no problem because they contain only the names of these officials. But any seal can contain the name. For example, I can make such seal here or in Delhi and then sign any document by it. Official seal and self-made seal with the name are two different things. And this is why the Tibetan delegates hide their official seals. If a treaty was acquired under the threat of force, the victim state never loses the right to declare its invalidity, which is what the Dalai Lama and other Tibetan officials did following their immigration. From the standpoint of international law, the 17-point agreement was and is illegitimate. However, let's try to adopt the point of view that those who believe that this agreement was legitimate. Because of the Tibetan uprising in 1979, this agreement was no longer adhered to. In fact, it was nullified by the Order of State Council of China on March 28, 1959, and the subsequent actions of the People's Republics of China. The well-known uprising of 1950s in Tibet was held without participation of Tibetan government. Consequently, the Tibetan side is not responsible for the uprising and the breaking the agreement. Responsibility for this lies with the Chinese side. Nevertheless, the latter theoretically could continue adhering to the agreement after the uprising, but did not want to do so. Thus, if we assume that the Chinese rule in Tibet was legitimized by the 17-point agreement, which is often repeated in China now, yes? If we will assume that it was legitimized in Tibet by 17-point agreement, we will have found that since 1959 this legitimization has been ended by the Chinese side. Therefore, the situation returned to the situation before the agreement, yes, which was the independence of Tibet. Recognition of Tibet as integral part of China by foreign states, which is well known and what China wants every time in international relations. But from the international law, it is no more than opinion of the states at a given moment of time. It does not change the real status in Tibet, and we know that this is subject to change, recognition or not recognition. Thus, we can come to following conclusions. First, Tibet was not a part of China or under Chinese dominance because the Yuan and Qing empires were not China. Tibet was not connected with China by Mongol or Manchu dominance. Tibet was neither conquered by the Qing Empire nor peacefully included in it on a legal basis. The status of one country is as a legitimate part of the other. The vassal suzerain relations involve mutual consent. It was not the case of Tibet and Qing. At the same time, neither Qing emperors nor the Dalai Lamas denied the priest-patron relations. Therefore, just these priest-patron relations remains a formal basis of the Tibet-Qing relations. The same concerns earlier Tibet-Yuan relations, in fact, Tibet-Mongolian relations. The Qing suzerainty instead of these relations was first imposed only in the 20th century by a third party and against the will of Tibetans who did not recognize this suzerainty. By the time of the collapse of the Qing Empire in 1912, the priest-patron relations were destroyed by the Qing authorities, and the Dalai Lama, as the legal head of Tibet, declared independence. To the time of the formation of People's Republic of China, Tibet corresponds to all generally accepted criteria of statehood. The concept of one Chinese nation that includes 5 races or minority nationalities was invented by the Han nationalists without any participation of Tibetans and Mongols who sought independence from China, actually the new Han nation-state. The Tibet is an integral part of China concept appears only in the 20th century. Then, contemporary Chinese doctrine concerning Tibet is based on an unjustified merger of traditional Sinocentric worldview with modern international law. Inclusion of Tibet into People's Republic of China was illegitimate. Tibetans are denied the rights of self-determination, so the local authorities in Tibet, installed by the Chinese governmental bodies, reflect the will of the latter, therefore the will of Beijing, and not the will of Tibetan nation. In the eyes of most Tibetans, the Dalai Lama continues to have spiritual authority. The central Tibetan administration, to whom he transferred his secular power, preserves the legacy and continuity of the legitimate Tibetan governments formerly ruled in Lhasa. Therefore, the central Tibetan administration is a legitimate representative of Tibetan nation. The demand for independence of the Tibetan state cannot be regarded as a separatism. This is not a demand to separate apart from the state and create a new state, because Tibet was state in the past. From the other hand, the proposals of His Holiness the Dalai Lama that Tibetans will follow the middle way instead of seeking independence are totally rejected by the Chinese communist authorities. This rejection resulted in the lack of progress in negotiations between the Tibetan and Chinese sides. However, this does not mean that the Tibetan question was resolved and Tibet is now inalienable part of China. Actually, the lack of progress in these negotiations means that Tibetan question remains in the same situation as in the past, which means that Tibet remains an occupied state. And finally, I can note that Chinese claims to any Indian lands adjacent to Tibet are totally illegal. There are many evidences for this. In particular, with regard to this my lecture, this issue concerns relations of India with the state of Tibet, but not with China? Thank you.
My question relates to the same 1994 Shimla Convention. Under what compulsion the Chinese government, the US-led government, agreed to send their representative at Shimla? Because I have been reading different books and got the impression that the US high government was apprehensive or it was not willing to send its representatives to Shimla.
The Chinese representative to Simla was finally sent. But nevertheless, the problem was that final decisions were not signed by all three sides, because the Chinese representative received instruction from his government that he must not sign such type of convention. And this was the result that Tibetans and the Englishmen have signed separate protocol, as you mean this, yes? Without participation of China, yes? And this protocol, which was an attachment to Simla Convention, included article that Tibet recognizes itself vessel to China. But it is curious that the lack of the Chinese signature meant that this suzerainty was not legally accepted by China. And Simla Convention does not change the status of Tibet. This is interesting. If China would sign this part, for example, this protocol, yes, so all three parties agree that, and Tibetan party and Chinese party agree that Tibet is vassal to China. But China did not want to sign this. Therefore, they did not accept the suzerainty over Tibet. It is a curious thing which was not described, but legally it looks like this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the good
Thank you. Oh, thank you.